Okay, so this video is going to be on type 1 and type 2 errors from chapter 20. You need to be able to tell the difference between the two and be able to logically think about like consequences of a type 1 error and a type 2 error as well. So let's go through the definitions first. A type 1 error is when you reject the null hypothesis, which means you proved what you're trying to prove, but you were wrong. So you rejected the null, but the null is actually true. So you found convincing evidence to prove your HA, but you were wrong. You found evidence to find a defendant guilty, but he was not guilty. It's also known as a false positive. You found you tested positive for something. You were to prove somebody had like a disease, like COVID, but the test is wrong and they didn't actually have COVID. So that's a type 1 error. Next one's a type 2 error, which means you failed to prove what you were trying to prove. You failed to reject the null when the null was actually false. So you failed to find convincing evidence, but you were wrong. A good example is you failed to find evidence of a defendant was guilty, but he was guilty. So this is known as a false negative. So in this particular case, you failed to find evidence he's guilty, but he would walk free, right? So in the type 2 error, you're letting a guilty man walk free. At type 1 error, in terms of that one, we were letting an innocent man go to jail. Because we found evidence he was guilty, but he wasn't, right? And then for a type 2, we are letting a guilty man go free. So that would be like consequences. And a false negative is in terms of like a test. If you were test negative for COVID, but the test is wrong and you actually have it, that would be a type 2 error. So for a type 1 error, for like the COVID, what would be the problem here? You would test positive, but it's actually wrong. So you would take a lot of precautions, like you had COVID, and it would just be wrong. It'd be precautions you really didn't need to take. There's not a huge problem there, right? Now this one, a false negative, where you don't think you have COVID, but you do, you might continue to hang out with your friends and stuff, and you might spread COVID. So that would be, type 2 error would be really bad in this one, right? So be able to just look at random situations and figure out like what a type 1 and a type 2 would be in those situations. Let's go down to some problems. Like let's look at the matched pairs one on this sheet. The soft drink company was doing research about a new design for a can. And remember, we did our research on this and we failed to find convincing evidence. We failed to find convincing evidence, right? But what if we were wrong? What if there was convincing evidence and one of the cans was better than the other? Well, that would be a type 2 error, right? A type 2 error is in we failed to prove it, but we were wrong. So that would be a type 2 error that we made, and the consequences would be we failed to find that there's actual difference, and there is, so we failed to take advantage of that and pick the better can, right? What would a type 1 error be in this situation? It would be like if we did this test and we proved one of the cans was better and it isn't. So we used a can and it's not actually better. And that would be a type 1 error, right? And that's not that big of a deal on this one. Neither one is like a huge deal. They might lose some money here and there, but probably not a ton of money. I doubt the can makes that much difference. So we're not talking high stakes with these errors in the soft drink company. Now let's look at some other ones here. Let's look at the polling data, this first one right here, the one sample z-test. So they were theorizing that the Hispanic population has changed. Now, say we found evidence the Hispanic population did change. We were able to prove that the Hispanic population changed, but we were wrong. So what would be the consequences of that? We might mess up our polling data. If we were trying to give people predictions on who's going to win an election or something, we might be wrong because we have our Hispanic population proportion off, which can affect the voting, right? So that would be a type 1 error. We proved that there was a difference and there isn't. What about a type 2? A type 2 would have the same problem, right? As in, we failed to prove there is a difference, but there actually is. There is more or less Hispanics than normal. We would just assume it was normal, and we would have errors in our polling data. So the errors are very similar consequences. They're the exact opposite of each other, but they would have similar consequences where your data would be off either way, right? So I'm just thinking of each one. This one right here, the UN claiming there was a higher rate of illiteracy in men than in women. So if we would have been able to prove this one, and we didn't, we were unable to prove it in the problem, but say we were. If we were able to find convincing evidence that men have higher illiteracy rates, but we were wrong, that would be a type 1 error, right? What would be the consequences of that? Well, we might put out programs specifically for men, targeting men to help with the illiteracy rates, but we're wrong. They're about the same. We should have offered it to both, right? And that would be the consequences. We failed to offer it for women when we should have. Think about a type 2 error here. We failed to prove it, but we should have been able to. So we failed to prove that men have higher illiteracy rates, but they do have higher illiteracy rates. So we might have failed to act on it. Like we failed to make programs for the men to help literacy rates, but we should have. And so we lost an opportunity to help the men there, right? So just be able to look at any situation and think about like what the consequences are in that situation. These last two on here have very little consequences. Like this one right here, with the dance songs and the top 200 songs, beats per minute. We were trying to prove that dance songs have lower beats per minute. Well, a type 1 error would be that we proved that the dance has lower beats per minute, but it actually doesn't. Can't think of very many consequences there. I mean, who cares? Not many consequences involved in that. What about the type 2 error? A type 2 error is we failed to prove it, which is what happened in the problem. We failed to prove that the dance songs have lower beats per minute, but they actually do have lower beats per minute, which has no real bearing in terms of consequences, right? I mean, this was just the guy was curious and he was just wondering if one had higher beats per minute than the other. It's one of those things where you just check it and you try to find it just because you're curious. It doesn't have big implications and there's not going to be any big consequences in that area. Same thing with this one with the movies. A type 1 error would be that we proved that his friends and family watch more movies when they don't. What's the consequences of that? Not much. I mean, he thought they watch more movies, but they don't. And then a type 2 error is he failed to prove they watch more movies, but they do watch more movies. And the consequences for that are almost nothing, right? So it just depends on the situation where the consequences could be bad or good, right? Like on these, it didn't really matter that much. If you took one like a test for leukemia or a test for cancer or a test for something big like that for COVID, that had big hits, right? That had a big difference. If we test for cancer and we make a type 1 error, like say we test for cancer and we prove the person has cancer but they don't, well, that's going to cause a lot of inconvenience to them. We'll probably run more tests, make them do some things they really didn't want to do, maybe spend more money than they want. But in the end, they would figure it out eventually, and they would figure out they don't have cancer and they'd let them go. So it would cost some inconvenience and some money, a type 1 error. But a type 2 error on a cancer patient like that, where you fail to prove they have cancer, but they do, that could be deadly. Because you're sending that person home when they have cancer, and that cancer could go from like stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4, and it could grow from something that would have been curable to something that they can't cure, and it could cost that person their life, a type 2 error. So it all depends on the situation, but as long as you conceptually know the difference between the two, you should be good on this test. All right, that is type 1 and type 2 errors.